Thank you all for that. So that's twice in 12 hours in which I've heard someone amazing, first y'all and then Danielle, talk about me. And in this testimony I'm about to give, it blows me away because God will transform me. God will transform me in ways that you wouldn't even think are possible, because sometimes I think of the old creation, right? And I know that one has passed away, but if that version of me could hear how people talk about me now, it'd sound like a stranger. So let's go ahead and get into it, and let's discuss the transformational power of Jesus and his love. So before I begin the next part, I would like you to do something for me. I want you to think of that one person God has placed in your life, the person that weighs most heavy on your heart, the one so completely lost there is no humanly way they could find their way back to God. Do you have someone in mind? Good. Now we can begin. I was born in Union Hospital in Dover, July 13th of 1988, to my father David and my mom Kathy. Mama C, you might know her. My life began with a fight. I was born with a cleft palate and would have several surgeries to correct it before I turned one. But God was watching over me, and the surgeries corrected it without any complications. My childhood was a good one compared to so many others I grew up with. I loved meeting new people and making friends. I was fascinated with taking things apart to see how they worked, and I loved to build things, to watch people and things grow and change, to see how they work their gifts in this world. This is the way I saw God at work in the world, the many parts of his creation speaking testimony to his grand design. I saw the world this way because this is who God made me to be. I grew up in the church. I was saved, baptized, and received the gift of the Spirit before I even reached middle school. I never lacked for church. My parents were heavily involved as youth leaders at our church. My father even became the preacher of his own church right up here on 4th Street for some time, and I even gave a sermon a time or two where I'm proud to say no one fell asleep. As I got older, I struggled to fit in school. I was made fun of for the appearance of my cleft and my beliefs. I couldn't hide the cleft, but I could hide my beliefs. So I started quietly packing them away as I went to school and slowly as I went into public in general. Before long, I was living a dual life, Brian in church, Brian in the world. This duality began to create a fracturing in my mind and in my soul. I began to have doubts about my faith. I had so many questions, but in my church there was a strong spirit of legalism. So I was seized by fear, afraid to ask or reach out to anyone. By the time I reached my junior year of high school, I was smoking cigarettes and drinking. By my senior year, I was smoking pot and experimenting with pain pills. James 1:6, but let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. After high school, I drifted for a few years. I had no real sense of purpose. I had stopped attending church at this point and was fully living in the world. With few prospects and little money from all the partying, I decided in 2009 I would join the Army. I reported to Fort Benning, Georgia in March of that year and immediately knew I was in over my head. The long days and short nights crammed full of physical training, mental games, technical manuals. There was never a day I thought I was going to make it through. But I put my head down and powered through each day out of sheer stubbornness. It wasn't until we completed the final ruck march for our graduation that I realized I was going to make it. While we were all packing on that last day, getting ready to go onto our various advanced training stations, some of the guys were talking to our drill sergeant. The facade of the mean, angry NCO had dropped. We were, to a degree, soldiers now, so he was offering some advice and insights on our careers. I wasn't directly involved in the conversation, but because of alphabetical ordering, my bunk was near the front of the bay. I was listening to him as I packed. One of the guys asked him a question about combat. He talked about remembering your training and the technical manuals and knowing who to follow, quote, the dangerous ones. Then out of nowhere, he turned and pointed to me and said, dangerous ones like Everett there. I paused and inquisitively asked, drill sergeant, He looked me in the eye and he said, "I've seen you. There's a monster inside of you, Everett. Don't be afraid of it. It'll keep you alive." I finally had an identity again. I stopped smoking pot and messing with pills for the next few years. I wanted to be a good soldier, but in this time, my drinking really ramped up. The stresses of the armies were hard on all of us. Drinking was the best answer, we told ourselves. I was even told during my medic training that if you want your guys to trust you, drink with them. If you want them to love you, drink them under the table. In 2011, two big things happened to me. First, I was married. Second, I went to Afghanistan. I was headed to a combat outpost named Monty in the Kunar province. It was a site of intense fighting along the Afghan-Pakistani border. On our way into country, we would pass guys coming out, and I ran into a group of the 101st guys that had been at Monty. He said it had become so dangerous at Monty, they greeted everyone coming in with the same thing. "Welcome to Camp Monty. Here's your Purple Heart." He was not exaggerating. We took several casualties in the first few months, including one of my guys, Knudsen. He lived, but he was unable to keep fighting, so I took over his position on the gun line, loading the 105mm howitzer. It was a rough couple months, but I received good news that helped renew my spirits. I'd been able to get in contact with my wife. She told me she was pregnant. We were going to have a child. Being a father had been on my heart for a long time, and it felt surreal that it was coming to pass. But this was Afghanistan, the place where hope came to die. The worst day of deployment came in early June of that year. I was woken, as so often happened, by the sound of incoming enemy fire. I was putting on my gear when the mass casualty sign came over the radio. I grabbed my aid bag and ran to the aid station to assist. I pushed through a crowd of Afghan soldiers to get in. Because of their presence, I assumed that their compound had been hit. But once I got inside, a scene of horror greeted me. Because the local village was friendly to us, the Taliban had decided to target a group of children playing outside that morning. Our mass casualty was several kids from the village of Asmar. I immediately went to the first kid I saw, a girl laying on a stretcher in the hallway. She was about my nephew's age. I knelt down and began doing the trauma assessment on her. To this day, I could tell you in bloody detail all of her injuries and her vitals, and they all said one thing: she was dead. The few vitals that did show were a body that didn't know it was dead yet. I ignored every human instinct to stay there and hold their hand till it happened, but there was work to do. So, like a robot, I stood up, stepped over, and started working on the next kid. The boy was about 11 or 12 years old. It's honestly hard to tell an Afghan child's age sometimes. Due to consistent malnourishment and stresses, this stunts growth. The average Afghan child is nearly 20% smaller than an American child of the same age. His legs had been shredded by shrapnel. He had been near the edge of the blast. I saw dark red and spurting blood flow, which indicated a venous laceration. I began to pack the holes with combat gauze to control the bleeding. He began to scream in pain. I took it as a good thing. His airway was open. My Pashtun was garbage, but I tried to get him to control his breathing, which he does. Breathing is rapid but good. Once I was done packing all the holes, I started an IV to help with blood volumization, wrapped him in a blanket to regulate body temp, which stabilized his circulation. We tried to get a helicopter for medevac for them, but none were available, so they would have to be loaded on trucks and driven nearly 30 minutes away. Afghan soldiers jumped in with proficiency and urgency and took him out with the rest of the kids. But my day wasn't done yet. The little girl had fully given up the ghost while we were working for what seemed like an eternity. I came out of the trauma room to see the body bag on the floor. And the only one who would get near it was Sergeant Isler. I had never seen that man flinch even in the face of incoming enemy fire. But this was different. We needed to load up the little girl's body so her parents could say goodbye and give her a proper funeral. In the end, I was the only one who would pick up the bag with him. It'll forever haunt my memories as I watched this stone of a man walk with his eyes closed, tears streaming down his face, quietly just saying, "It's just a deer. It's just a deer." I went back to the gun line. Guys asked me what happened. I walked past him, and the only words I could muster were, They were effing kids. They all paused dead in their tracks. I walked off, dropped my gear, grabbed a coffee, and began smoking cigarettes, trying to somehow process this. Several other guys came to check on me, talk to me. I couldn't remember anything they said. The look of care and compassion on their faces is all I remember. I was busy running things in my head, the equation of devastation I had just witnessed. I tried to fit the idea of my loving and just God into this equation, but I just couldn't make it fit. I settled on a truth that was palatable for me then. God wasn't real. And at that moment, I felt the bottom drop out of my soul and felt myself descend into a deep darkness. What I thought was confirmation of this new truth came a few days later. I'd finally managed to get in contact with home again. My mom first. She told me I needed to talk with my wife. When I finally got a hold of her, she told me she had cheated on me, that the child she was carrying wasn't mine. I let the moment hang in the air for what felt like an eternity before I told her I was going to find out who he was and kill him and his entire family. I clung to my drill sergeant's words. There's a monster inside of you, Everett. Don't be afraid of it. It'll keep you alive. Proverbs 30:33. For the pressing of milk produces curds, the pressing of the nose produces blood, and the pressing of anger produces strife. I feel shame at many of the things that I did during my time in Afghanistan. Even worse was the fact that after what my wife told me she had done, I didn't even see the face of the enemy anymore. I wasn't fighting for ideals or honor and country. All I could see was the face of the man that had destroyed my marriage. In the end, the fighters of the Taliban merely had the poor fortune of getting in the path of my unending rage. But an ocean's worth of my rage couldn't wash away an ounce of my pain. I was in deep, searing, unending pain in my mind, in my soul, and in my body. I had sustained an injury one day while we were taking fire. I couldn't stop, so I finally went and saw the base's PA. He gave me tramadol for my back and my knee. At the time, it was hailed as a non-habit-forming alternative to opioids. So he gave me enough for my injury and a pharmaceutical amount since I oversaw one of the casualty collection points. This became my only relief. Perfect little addiction. Took them several times a day, every day. Enough to take the edge off, but still function. In time, it wasn't enough, and one of the guys let me on to their big secret. Their wife had been smuggling oxycodone to him in candy bags. He told me he had seen me struggling and started splitting what was coming in with me. Of course, the supply came to a screeching halt when their marriage did, and thank God I was cut off from that supply. But like a good addict, I never told him I had enough tramadol for the two of us. Skipping ahead, I redeployed to Schofield Barracks in February 2012. I was chosen as part of the advanced party to help set up the battalion aid station. I was drinking myself to sleep with at least a six-pack a night. I hid all this behind a facade of professionalism. I was the medic people asked for by name. I was selected to be cadre for the division's expert field medical badge course, and ironically, saved the careers of several soldiers by convincing them to go to rehab when they disclosed their addiction to me. But when I was alone in my room, I was doing things like trying to forge veterinarian credentials since tramadol through vet sources was unregulated. Towards the last few months in the Army, I wasn't sleeping, spending my time off drinking, or getting high on what painkillers I could buy, what I could find or buy. My professional edge was dulling. I started missing formations, and honestly, if I hadn't been actively seeking psychiatric help, I probably would have been kicked out of the Army. Proverbs 25:28. A man without self-control is like a broken-into city, left without walls. I was officially out of the Army in January 2013, and while I was content to resume my old life and leave the horrors behind me, at least this is what I told everyone, everyone could see I had changed. I became annoyed at their concern. I was fine. I remember the one night sitting and drinking with my sister and talking about how things were. Both of our lives were a mess at the time. She said to me, you don't joke like you used to. You don't laugh anymore. I paused, not knowing how to respond. To tell her all the horrible things I had done. They needed to stay locked inside of me to keep her and everyone safe. But more importantly, if she knew all the things I had done, that she wouldn't love me anymore. So all I could respond with was, I guess nothing is that funny anymore. I struggled with this issue deeply, being lovable. Not just all the awful things I had seen and done, but how my wife had cheated on me. So I found a new addiction to cover my pain, sex. But it was all meaningless and empty. As soon as it was over, I felt the deep, gnawing emptiness return. In time, a new hatred began to form. I hated to see couples together and me. It was all a lie. If my marriage was a sham, weren't all relationships a sham? So I began going out of my way to seduce girlfriends and wives. Still stuck at war, the sex was just a means to an end, to destroy. At my worst point, I had 2 women I was seeing with their husbands and the other's fiancés' work schedules worked out, so I never had to be alone. I was so utterly broken, I never let a thought of guilt persist for even a second. Asked by one of them one time about love, I told her it wasn't an honest emotion. Hate was. I said to her, well, my wife was sleeping with another man. The Taliban showed up every day to fight. I hated them, and they hated me, and that's the most honest relationship I've ever had. I was clinging to the only thing I could still feel. There's a monster inside of you, Everett. Don't be afraid of it. It'll keep you alive. Soon, the sex, drugs, and alcohol were not enough to keep the horrors at bay inside of me. I hated closing my eyes to sleep, fearing those images would come back. Sometimes while driving alone, I would just scream at the top of my lungs so the screams in my head would just stop for a second. Sometimes I'd scream so intensely I'd pull a muscle in my neck. When people would comment about me moving my neck funny, I'd just tell them it must have been how I slept. Being alone was the worst. Stare at myself in the mirror. And I told people what was bothering me is I couldn't recognize the man staring back at me. I'd come to hate people, and even those I still felt for, I felt a strong sense of possession and responsibility. I had to destroy everything and everyone that wasn't mine or made me feel small. I had become cruel and callous, vile and vicious. I had become everything I ever despised. When we live the lies of the devil, it's not just that we become someone God never meant us to be. We end up becoming the exact opposite of everything God meant us to be. 1 Peter 5:8, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. It was a year or 2 after leaving the army, deep in the depths of my sin, I began having this sensation that I was being chased. For me, I thought it was just a death that I had so narrowly avoided in Afghanistan stalking me. I had trouble holding down jobs due to my addictions, but also because I never felt like I could stay in one place for too long before that sensation would creep up on me again. I'd finally settled into a job my brother-in-law had got me down in Yerkesville. I'd resigned myself to my fate, was drinking all the time. I was in a state of emotional and spiritual coma, unfeeling and unbothered, until I had my world rocked. A friend of mine from high school, Lacey, she had cancer. It was liver cancer that had metastasized to her lungs. In October 2017, she was dead, leaving behind her young son and daughter. She didn't even make it to 30 years old, a fact that still haunts me when I can hear her calling me kid. Now, Lacey didn't die on some distant battlefield in the heat of combat. She was a pharmacy tech who didn't have the proper insurance coverage. She needed to get a small cop checked out. Working feet from the medicines that could have saved her life, an accountant somewhere had taken my friend's life and moved it into their profit column. I was no longer unfeeling or unbothered, and anger welled up in me again. I had a new war to fight. 2018, I returned to school to get the education I needed to take hold of any sort of lever of power that might allow me to effect change in this unjust world. In those classrooms, I found a new challenge, and the old soldier returned. Focused, professional, dedicated, I threw myself into every subject, gathering every piece of knowledge I could as a weapon. But the more I came to learn, the more I realized the problem was bigger and far more reaching than I had realized. I'd been asleep for so long, I hadn't realized how broken the world was. And the more I saw the brokenness of the world, the more I saw that brokenness reflected in me. Realize that a better world doesn't begin with governments or corporations or institutions. It begins with each one of us. So I began searching for the heart of evil, if you would, its source. Maybe if I could find it, there would be some way that it could be killed. Began to examine the lives of wicked and despotic people throughout history, and I found things in their lives that reflected in my own. As I examined deeper, I descended into a spiritual darkness so black that you could scarcely see your hand in front of your face. A darkness so deep, it makes you question if you even exist at all. And in this journey, suddenly from the void, something began to take shape. To my shock, what stepped forth wasn't a great dragon or some great horned beast. In the middle of that darkness, what I saw staring back at me was me. Then those words that had been keeping me alive came back to me. There's a monster inside of you, Everett. Don't be afraid of it. It'll keep you alive. For the first time in a long time, I felt a deep and abiding sense of shame. And I knew I needed to change before anything else would. Of course, this was doomed since it was human effort. I had cut back on my drinking so I could focus on my education. But I was smoking every day. When I wasn't in class, I was high. And on the weekends, I would throw in getting drunk. But I began to have this urge to confess to one of my friends how I had betrayed him. I'd slept with one of his ex-girlfriends. So I invited him over, and before he came, I was terrified. I hadn't been held accountable for so long. Pure terror washed over me. Spent the whole day chain smoking cigarettes, smoking weeds, drinking anything to alleviate the impending sense of doom. I was sitting there running the scenario for the 1,000th time in my head of how the conversation would go when my heart began to race. My vision began to narrow, and that sensation that something was chasing me was closing in. I told myself I was dying. I knew it. I went to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face, but it didn't help. I walked out knowing this was it, called out for my buddy Mike. We had served in Afghanistan as medics together and were roommates at the time. I collapsed on the floor. Then something miraculous happened. I reached out to heaven. I called to God to forgive me. And as I turned to look up, I saw him. That sensation that had been chasing me all the years, it was Jesus. He had never left me or forsook me. He was there when I was at my worst and my most unlovable. I had turned my back on him, but he had never turned his back on me. Isaiah 58:9. Then you will call and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help and he will say, here I am. I had found my way back to him, but this was only the first step back onto the right path, the one he had designed me for all those years ago. The road to hell may be wide and straight, but thank God it has plenty of off-ramps. I was still smoking weed and drinking, but in 2020 I transferred to a high university with a new heart, if not yet a new mind. 2020 was a rough year, but I thank God for it. After the lockdowns, I spent most of my time alone in my apartment. I spent a lot of it sober, since it was hard to get weed and alcohol was losing its luster for me. And all that time alone in the chaos, something beautiful happened. I rediscovered the still small voice of God. I could hear him again, and he was honing me to hear it in the noise and the chaos of the world. And this time, he also blessed me with jobs that would build my political career, jobs that I could have never imagined having. Worked for the census. I served as Deputy Director of Elections for Harrison County and worked for Job and Family Services of Ohio. I was still far from being a great Christian, but he blessed me disproportionately to my works. In 2021, I had an opportunity to move to Portland, Oregon to work for a nonprofit called Northwest Pilot Project. Their work specialized in helping houseless seniors. It was a dream come true. The staff were friendly and welcoming, and the work was rewarding. They saw something in me, that new Christian heart, and even for non-believers, it garnered me great favor. At one point in a meeting with the head of the charity, she asked me if I would be interested in running for the mayor of Portland. It's an interesting thing when you live Jesus. Not just how it rewards you in your life, but also says so much even about the non-believers around you. Because while they believe that you are the answer to all the problems they have, when you live Jesus, you know that they recognize Jesus is the answer to all their problems. In August, Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, and old demons reared their ugly heads. Suddenly, the weight of all I had done there came rushing back to me. At this same time, I was getting some hard cases. Clients who had housing but were killing themselves with their addictions. I'd sit and talk with them for hours, but it made no difference. I felt so powerless. One day on my walk back home, I came to an intersection and paused. I was still trying to save myself with works, but I seemed powerless to actually do anything good. And before me, I saw a vision of my life. Stretching all the way to the horizon, I saw a trail of human misery and wreckage I had caused. Was I only capable of destruction? Was the only thing I could do to make a better world was to make a world without me? Suddenly I heard the still small voice of God, Brian, and I came to my senses. I realized I was about to walk into traffic to end my life. And then I heard him say, "It's time to go home." I returned to Ohio in November thinking I had wrecked everything God had meant for me, but I was oh so wrong. The first few months of home were hell. My grandfather died while I was there, and he passed away while I was doing CPR on him. And having a terrible family secret revealed. The original part of my testimony, I talked about this, but people involved have asked me not to say it. I couldn't understand what God was trying to do, but his plan soon came to full fruition. Those events had wrecked other jobs I had lined up so that I could get a job at the VA here in New Philadelphia. That's where I met Danny and Danielle. Danielle invited me here to CR, and they both encouraged me to come to church. Here where I've got to meet old classmates who I missed out on being friends with, where I found caring and supportive family, most importantly, where I rediscovered a real relationship with God. Here I am, not the man I was, but the man God made me to be. Now, do you remember that person you thought of before? The lost cause? Well, I'm them, and they are me. I'm just as bad, if not worse, than they were. And here I stand before you, a new creature, sober from drugs, alcohol, sexual sin, and my anger. So don't give up the prayers and intercession, and above all, don't forget to keep showing Christ-like love and patience, like my mom did. She could have dusted the sandal from her feet 1,000 times as she called out to me, and she didn't, because she understands that there is one more rejoicing in heaven over one soul, and that all of hell rejoices when we turn our back on someone. 2 Peter 3, 8 through 9, but do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promises, as some count slowness, but is patient towards you, not wishing that any should perish, but all should reach repentance. Trust me, God hasn't given up on them, neither should we. It's been an honor to do this and to just be a part of a bigger thing that's been happening over the past few days. So, Travis, Leslie, Bradley, Danielle, thank you for putting together Hope, because that's what we're here for. We are called to care about the foreigner and the refugee because we are the ultimate refugees. We're the citizens of the kingdom of heaven, a kingdom with perfect justice, with perfect kindness. There is no nation on this planet that can rival it, so therefore we are not home. We're called to care for the sick and the lame because we're citizens of a kingdom that has no sickness and no lameness. We're called to go to the lonely because we are from a kingdom where no one is alone and knows that they are loved. We are called to the hungry because we eat of a bread that will keep us full forever. The nature of the world, all sin, greed, sexual immorality, these things are the fruits of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not just what we do, it's just the sheer brokenness of the world that is sin, and that's why we're called against it. That's why we're to be compassionate when the world is cruel, to be patient when it is in a hurry. Sometimes, in my studies, the one thing that frustrates me is a lot of how we make a better nation or a better world gets boiled down to numbers. And sometimes, and a lot of times, growing up in the church, we do that a lot. Because what Jesus did on the cross is powerful. He came to save the world. But sometimes we lose our focus and we think of the great revival with people together on stage in all denominations and thousands being saved at a time. But Jesus went to the cross and we were given an individual choice to accept that salvation, so the reality isn't seas of people being saved. When Jesus went to the cross, he said, what is one life weighed against another? Your life, your life. Jesus doesn't go to save crowds. He kneels down into the dirt, to the dirtiest, most low value, unacceptable people of this world. It lifts you by your head and says, you are loved. You are worth everything. Jesus gave up sitting at the right hand of the Father to endure being human for us. And then as a human, listen, the flogging, the beating, the public marching, and the crucifixion, those are all individual punishments under Roman law. They subjected him to every punishment. I'm guilty. I stood before the throne of God, and I'm guilty. You've heard my story. My innocence, my righteousness comes from Christ, and while we accept that, while he justifies us, I've always struggled with the understanding of the depths of that. It's not that Jesus just stands up to the Father and goes, man is innocent. He stands up and he says, I will serve your sentence. The perfect man. And that is why the fruits of the spirits are patient, kindness, long-suffering. It does not seek its own way. Sometimes it's hard. It's hard to minister. Sometimes we get frustrated. There's so many unkind words. But can we suffer like Christ? Suffering's a virtue. Okay. Consider the grapes and the wheat. The wheat that was threshed from the field, and the heads plucked off and ground into dust, mixed with oil, and baked in a hot oven, turned into a loaf. And then the Son of God said, this is my body, broken for you. Or consider the grape, everything it loses, to be crushed, to be left with juice, the skin, the flesh, so much of it, the pain and endurance of that. But it was left to ferment in the vessel, and it was poured out into a cup. And the Son of God said, this is my blood, shed for you. Sometimes the suffering is just getting rid of things you don't need because the world has poured so much garbage on you. hearing the difference of who I was even 5 or 6 years ago to my friends, my brothers, and my sisters in here has been transformational because I've surrendered my body to Christ, my mind to Christ, and my soul to Christ. But the most mind-blowing thing is it hasn't led me on some path that I am afraid of or made somebody that I can't recognize. This is who I've always wanted to be in my heart of hearts. So I want to encourage you to join me up here on this altar. Pray for your friends, pray for your family, pray for that one person. I'm going to pray for my enemies because that's scriptural, and I don't do that enough. So I encourage you to come up here and pray. If you got things to do, I understand, but I'm going to hang around here because God doesn't have a timetable. And while all the things of this world are passing away, the one thing on this earth that is forever is the human soul. And that is the thing that we should be focused on. And in my testimony, I can tell you right now, while we have had the joy to be here in the family and stand before the presence of God, there is someone out there right now that is sobered up this morning and the screaming is returned to their head. Right now, there's someone out there that woke up in the bed of another stranger. Still feels no love. There's someone out there right now who's laying in bed with the weight of the world and the lies of the enemy, and the heaviness is returned to their bone, and all they can think right now is it was a mistake not to kill myself last night. So I'm going to stay here and pray for them. Thank you. God bless you all.